Hi, I'm Sam Brown. I'll be delivering my talk for the Church History Symposium for 2020 called Cultural Context and the Integrity of the First Vision. I'm doing it remotely, trying to be sensitive and thoughtful about COVID-19. And as a healthcare worker, as a physician who's going to be treating the sickest of the sick as they arrive, it seemed important to me to practice some appropriate cultural distancing. And I am grateful for the opportunity to use the video mechanism to address you. I hope you'll remember to wash your hands, not touch your face, not shake hands, and be careful. We will ultimately get through this, but we've got some important steps that we can take to limit the burden on the vulnerable among us. So with that, today I want to take an opportunity to read the first vision with an awareness of the differences between the culture at the time of the first vision, especially the culture that Joseph Smith inhabited, and the culture that we experience. And the reality is that people call it the modern world now, this is the world we inhabit for the last maybe 50 years especially, that this modern world is very different from the worlds that came before it. We are not our ancestors. And you can there are thousands of books that are written about this transition from the pre-modern world or the medieval world into the modern world. I think some of the brightest people are drawing attention to the fact that aspects of this culture are, in fact, a return to certain strains of paganism, probably especially Epicureanism, albeit with a little bit of a twist, and that there's this sense that you can say the word enlightenment, and that A, that means something, and B, what it does mean is a move away from superstition and benighted ideologies and witch trials and belief in demons and curses toward something that just radiates perfect wisdom and rationality. And the reality is that it's massively more complicated than people think. There are some wonderful things that have come out of especially the turn toward experimental science in the last few hundred years, and we're seeing that in technology and medicine. But crucially, in terms of our understanding of where we come from, what we're for, and what we ought to be doing with the time that we have, it's a philosophically very thin kind of ideology. And the thing to remember about this culture is that it was actually originally a religious reform, and it continues to be religious, just with a twist, and that twist seems to be in the direction of modern paganism. So I'm aware that I'm cutting a lot of corners here because there are just thousands of books written about this, but I wanted to emphasize that there's been a religious change. That religious change has been associated with culture, and that understands itself to be commonly enlightenment-based, with an asterisk for the complexity of that word, and related to a strict separation of the lived experience of people and their communities when it comes to understanding how we know the world and how we know what ought to happen in the world. And part of this transition has been a transition in the meaning of the word religion. Religion is a word that seems to come from Latin, but it's got deeper roots than that. And a strict etymology is debated. But even understanding and admitting that religion has a complicated history as a word, it's still reasonably clear in antiquity how people were using it, especially when they were using it in a neutral rather than a polemical sense. And religion in antiquity referred to a communal and interdependent way of living. It was a shared sense of how the world works and what the contexts, the broader cosmic, in fact, contexts for the world were. It was also common public rituals that were able to stitch together relationships with the gods and ultimately with the community represented by the state and by the extended families in Roman culture and ultimately in Greek culture, the familias, which we would think is a little bit smaller than a ward, for example. So religion was a way to connect to the gods and to society and to communities smaller than societies. Now, belief probably did play a role in religion. What precisely that role was is disputed, and it's certainly nowhere near the Protestant emphasis on individual belief that we see now. But crucially, even where belief mattered a lot, whether you believed that Persephone, in fact, was in bondage in the underworld because of the eating of the pomegranate or not, it wasn't extremely relevant to the experience of religion itself. Now, religion in the modern age, this is an inheritance first from the Catholic nominalist philosophers and then from the Protestants who sort of carried the torch for nominalism. Religion becomes a private belief. It's really an inventory of, or a list of the things that you can say, oh yes, I believe it. And there's a sense in which religion moves from being a context, the setting in which everything else makes sense and in which everything else is done, to being the text itself, a list of sacred words and a list of ideas about those sacred words. Increasingly over the last 100 years, religion has been seen sort of on a consumerist model, a free expression model, that it's a choice you make about your identity. Crucially, over the last about 50 years, that's a real intensification of earlier work. Churches have become institutions like any other that have to find their way in a culture that's generally anti-institutional. And crucially, for religion in the modern age, it's also true that specific styles of religion, especially this neo-pagan variant that we're seeing commonly in the West, receive more priority in the public square, whereas others, and this is specifically and most consistently confessional Christianity, although in Europe we're seeing a lot more discussion about Islam, those confessional models of religion are being discouraged. So we've got a sense that there's a move into questions about the individual, questions about specific truth claims or beliefs, and crucially a sense that the context of religion and the community in which it exists has to recede out of deference for another mode of religion that's increasingly categorized or classified as secular or secularist, although I'm going to confess that those are very complicated words with many different meanings. Now, I mentioned briefly this notion that individuals were different in antiquity, but I think it's important, and here Charles Taylor, the Catholic philosopher, who I think is very, very bright, if always in need of an editor, as many of us are, Charles Taylor has suggested that selves in antiquity were porous, they were open, they were embedded, they were affected by the world, they were affected by the cosmos, they were affected by the gods. And when they tried to understand who they were, they looked around themselves. They looked at their parents, they looked at the people in the church, they looked at the people among whom they lived, they looked at the world as a context within which they existed. This is that great chain of being or scale of nature. And that was how they understood who they were. And they sought to align themselves with mandates that came from the world itself, from God and from others. And they were not, in general, there are clearly exceptions, but they were not in general focused on finding some secret spring of their identity that came authentically from within themselves. Now, modern selves are, at a minimum, understood by themselves to be different. And I apologize, that language sounds a little funny, but I think it's true that modern selves are different than antique selves, and it occurs to me that the reason that they are different is complex, and some people disagree with that. They say, no, selves have always been the same all along. So I put that sort of scholarly disclaimer that at a minimum people report that selfhood is different. And crucially, this selfhood is punctual or buffered, according to Taylor's terminology, and it basically means that you're protected, that there's a kind of cloak that divides you from God, from the mandates of God or religion, as we understand it now, or that keep you safe from the encroachments of other people. And it's become a kind of quest for authenticity. And that word is such a complicated word, but it has something to do with the notion that instead of looking outward, instead of looking open to the world, to other people, to God, we're looking inward. We're enclosed inside ourselves. And the secret to the puzzle of ourselves is something we will find inside us. And there's another crucial component. In addition to always looking for ourselves inside ourselves, we are increasingly called to bear the burden of God. God provided order to the universe, provided meaning to the universe, was the reason that people did what they did, was the wellspring of morality. And increasingly we're making the argument in the modern world that we as individual human beings and maybe some generic notion of humanity need to be doing all the work that was once done by God. So that's the context that I think culturally we need to have in mind when we think about what the first vision might have meant. And first vision, this is a divine manifestation when Joseph Smith was a teen. Our best guess is that it happens around 1820. I don't think the date matters specifically, but I think 1820 is appropriate, and I'm glad to celebrate it now, 200 years later. And the first vision was not just a single event, but was a process, an experiencing process that shed different light at different times, that had different life contexts at different times in Joseph Smith's life. And crucially, I think, for us now, all of it took place in a very different cultural environment. And there are a variety, 4 or 5 of the earliest renditions of the first vision, and those have some very interesting differences. And unfortunately, because I think it's relatively, I was going to be a little inflammatory and say obtuse, but I think it's under-sophisticated in understanding the way society works, the way culture works, and the way human beings work, to feel like those differences are invalidating of the reality of the first vision. And I see increasingly in what I call the secularist internet anti-Mormonism, or SIAM, I see in these SIAM criticisms around the first vision this notion that the variations in the way the experience gets retold are important and somehow invalidate Joseph Smith's claims to prophethood. When you dig into them, you realize that these SIAM criticisms are really just the Protestant occult criticisms that I grew up on as an atheist in the 1980s, but they're coming from a different cultural platform that honestly is even more remote from the culture in which the first vision occurred and was reported. And in this talk, I want to zero in on one of the things that I remember from the Protestant anti-Mormon pamphlets that I read in the 80s, which was this notion that in some versions of the first vision account, Joseph Smith is talking about his own personal salvation. And in others, he's talking about the formal restoration of the church and priesthood after apostasy. And that there's a notion that it has to be one or the other, and the fact that at different points it's reported as one and then the other is an indication that the first vision is fabricated. But I think, as I hope the introduction of the first half of the talk has helped you understand that there are contextual questions at play. And one of these is, what's the distance between individual salvation and communal salvation? And is that distance real for Joseph Smith and the early Latter-day Saints? What is priesthood for? And when does it matter? And in what context does it matter? What is apostasy? How does apostasy happen, and how do you fix it? And I think it's also important contextually to understand what were the substance and meaning of evangelical conversion narratives in the early 19th century. I'm not able to explore that much in this talk, but I think it's important to understand that one of the contextual components that we're confronting is also what was going on with American Protestants. And they had not yet made the transitions that they do in subsequent centuries to more of this modern secular kind of idea. And I think it's worth walking through the accounts one by one quickly. The first is the 1832 biography. And that autobiography in 1832 begins by reciting what the church is and what it's authorized to do. And it describes, quote, the reception of the holy priesthood by the ministering of angels to administer the letter of the gospel. And further, quote, it's a confirmation and reception of the high priesthood after the holy order of the Son of the living God, power and ordinance from on high to preach the gospel in the administration and demonstration of the Spirit, the keys of the kingdom of God conferred upon Joseph Smith. As a part of this process, Joseph Smith searches the scriptures with, quote, all important concerns for the welfare of my immortal soul. And as he's trying to figure out, how am I saved and how is the world saved? These are complementary questions. He's well aware that the Protestants seem far away from God. So if your question is, how do I, as an individual, if that's a meaningful question, come to salvation? The question is going to have to grapple with the question of, well, what are the vessels or mechanisms of salvation? And if you're convinced that the Protestant churches are not, in fact, the vessels for that salvation, then it's natural and native to understand that The personal quest, to the extent it exists, is also a quest to know which of the churches provides a mechanism by which that salvation can come. In account number 2, which is the 1835 discussion with Robert Matthews, who was himself an unusual individual, and neither Matthews nor Joseph Smith was particularly pleased with the other at the end of the meetings they had in 1835. Quoting from that, you have, "Looking upon the different systems taught the children of men, I knew not who was right or who was wrong." Separate quote, "Considering it of the first importance that I should be right in matters that involve eternal consequences." James 1 through 5 drives him in a quest for information, and then the divine being that visits him, apparently God in this context, said unto me, "Thy sins are forgiven thee." He testified, he being that divine being, "unto me that Jesus Christ is the Son of God." And then there's an immediate transition into the Moroni visits that come after Joseph Smith's personal backsliding. So in the 1835 one, you have a little bit more cerebral encounter, a little bit more thinking about what might be right and what might be wrong, but always also around the question of what it means to be saved and what it means to feel confident that God and your family are able to be durably with you, both in life and in afterlife. Account 3 is the 1838 version that I memorized as a missionary some years ago, and that we know in the Pearl of Great Price. The purpose of the 1838, remember the 1838 canonized version is happening in the midst of a lot of confusion and violence in Missouri. The purpose for it is, quote, "to disabuse the public mind and put all inquirers after truth into possession of the facts as they have transpired." And there's a sense in which what he is seeing and describing in Missouri is also what he's seeing and describing in his memory of the 1820 experience. And specifically, it seems that the experience in 1838 is a kind of fulfillment of the insights that he received in 1820. He's praying, he's trying to figure out, how am I, how is the world, how are my family going to be happy and confident and together and godly? And the answer that he gets is, don't do it as a part of interdenominational strife among the Protestants. And then in 1838, he sees what happens, and he describes, quote, "priest contending against priest and convert against convert, so that all their good feelings one for another, if they ever had any, were entirely lost in a strife of words and a contest about opinions." And he talks in this same canonized version about some of the mixed motives that he had as he was really pondering these questions. And I don't mean mixed motives in the sense of nefarious. I mean that there was a lot going on as he was trying to understand these crucial questions. Quote, "My mind was called up to serious reflection and great uneasiness, but though my feelings were deep enough and pungent, still I kept myself aloof from all these parties." And then that classic line, "In the midst of this war of words and tumult of opinions, I often said to myself, what is to be done and how shall I know it?" And you see in that, once again, the interwoven braids or strands within a braid of these two broader questions. How can I, as an experiencer on the verge of the modern self, come to God in a durable and meaningful way? And how can the world be healed? How can the people I love and care about be a part of this process? And for Joseph Smith, and I've argued this in a lot of different settings, for Joseph Smith, these were inextricable goals. So the conclusion that Joseph Smith draws in the 1838 canonized version is that he shouldn't join any of the churches, precisely because they don't have the path for him, for his family, or for the world to true ultimate redemption. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that, actually, in the interest of time, I'll skip over that. Reach out to me later if you have a question. But there's this interesting mutual constitution that's happening. Spencer Fluman has talked about this between the Protestants and the Latter-day Saints. And then in account 4, the Wentworth letter, this is a classic that we know well. It's from 1842. It's Nauvoo. It's trying to prepare the world for the dominance of Nauvoo, and it's very outward focused. And in that setting, he very clearly draws out the interdependence. Quote, When about 14 years of age, I began to reflect upon the importance of being prepared for a future state. This is him wondering about himself. And upon inquiring the plan of salvation, this is broadly, what are the rules that apply to the world, to his family, to his nation, gets to the question of ecclesiology and of apostasy and restoration. I found that there was a great clash in religious sentiment. He says that in that context, he's enwrapped in a heavenly vision, and in that heavenly vision, quote, none of them, meaning these Protestant denominations, was acknowledged of God as his church and kingdom. So we've moved quickly today through some of the relevant highlights of the four key First Vision accounts, and we've been trying to trace this thread of the individual and the community, of pre-modern ideas about the way the world and cosmos work and modern ideas about that, and trying to open up the possibility that this is not a modern document meant to be read in modernist terms, but is in fact a kind of living document, a reflection of the relationship that exists between a person and a community more broadly, and that really is the trick of the restoration. That apostasy that we've talked so long and hard about may in fact be something that has been intensifying recently in this move away from communal, grounded, God-breathed, God-loved salvation that represents more than just individual self-expression or idiosyncratic beliefs. So by way of quick summary and farewell, for now, there's this notion that I remember very distinctly growing up and consuming the Protestant and Mormon pamphlets as a self-styled atheist in the 1980s, that there's this notion that there's a conflict between personal redemption and communal restoration. But that notion of a conflict is itself an artifact of secular modernist sensibilities that are foreign to Joseph Smith's views of the world. In the first vision, Joseph Smith was clearly, in all of the accounts, worrying about that joint problem of the complementarity of individual and communal salvation. And I'll confess, on the basis of some good work being done really just in the last half decade by evangelical Protestant historians, there is data to suggest that the Protestants were more communal than they're given credit for in general. I think that's true. Nevertheless, Joseph Smith's merger of individual and communal is more intense and sustained. And the first vision, interestingly, step back. The first vision really is a launching point for that community. And so as we think about the role of the first vision in Latter-day Saint theology and Latter-day Saint history and in the personal devotional lives of Latter-day Saints, I think this is a beautiful, living, fascinating document that is not only interesting and important in itself, but is interesting and important in the ways that it shows us the genesis and the life history, the backstory, if you want to sound cool, of really the key tenets of restoration that we see unfolding across Latter-day Saint history. And on that, I thank you for your attention.